Erev Tov, everyone. Tonight we're going to look at a mystery in the Torah, something that's difficult to understand. And when we have something challenging to understand in the Torah, there's a number of reasons why. It could be as simple as there's a word in ancient Hebrew that we don't fully understand, or a ritual that, again, if we were alive thousands of years, we could say, oh, this is how they used to do marriages, or this is how they did business deals. Now the Torah makes more sense. So some of those things we can figure out by learning new languages or archaeology. Another mystery might be something where the Torah intentionally leaves something blank, like the story of Cain veHevel, Cain and Abel, and what they said to each other in the field before Cain killed his brother. Some of those mysteries, there's no way of resolving them in the text. But the one we're going to look at tonight is a bit more interesting because it's something that when you read the text, it seems fairly straightforward. The text, it is what it is. However, because of our current philosophy, theology, understanding of the Torah, and hundreds of years of tradition, it's difficult or impossible for us to understand the Torah with the way the Torah is written with our modern understanding. So the question is our modern understanding wrong? I'm not going to say the Torah is wrong, but the question is, what do we do with the Torah when we read something and say, this can't be what it means because it doesn't work with our understanding of the universe? And it could be something as extreme and challenging as the creation of the universe. 7 days, but we know the universe is billions of years. So that there's a whole study, there's all books about how to understand the creation of the universe in light of science. But the topic we're going to look at tonight is not one of science, but rather of theology. And the theology is the body of God, or the lack thereof, because we'll look at those texts, but our understanding today is that God has no physical body. Not that God doesn't exist, not that God isn't something either in or of the universe, but to be able to high-five God or look God in the eye the way that ancient Greeks imagined Zeus as taking on a humanoid form, or even within Christianity, a lot of the ideas of God with the long beard, again, influenced by Greek culture. For Jews, there is no body. There's no head, there's no hands, but the problem is the Torah talks all the time about God's arm, God's long nose, and God's patience, etc. So we're going to look at one of the most famous examples of that in the Torah with Moshe supposedly seeing part of God. But the question is, if God doesn't have a body to see, what's going on here? So before we get into the text, a little bit of context is this is in the 33rd chapter of the book of Shemot, Exodus. And right before this in chapter 32 was the sin of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. And God is furious. God wanted to wipe out all the people, start from scratch with Moshe. Moshe asked God for mercy. God relented. But in this chapter, God said, Moshe is very concerned on behalf of himself and the people. God, I know you're mad, but please don't abandon us. And God says, I'll take the people into Israel. I will defeat your enemies. I'm still going to stick with you. I'm not going to be amongst you the way that I would have before. There are going to be some changes. Originally, God's tent, God's presence would have been right in the center of the people. But now the tent where God talks to Moshe is outside of the people. So Moshe keeps saying to God, I'm really concerned that your anger at the people is going to mean you're not going to be with me. But the text says, no, God speaks, and it uses the language panim al panim. God speaks to Moshe face to face. But even after all that, Moshe keeps saying, I'm really worried you're going to abandon me. And that leads to this paragraph, this section's verse 17 through 23. So Tamar, we're going to read this text. I'll refer to a few of the words in the Hebrew, but this is our core text, and we're going to try and understand it just as it is written. So Tamar, bevakasha, source number 1.
Shemot 33, 17 to 23. And the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have asked, for you have truly gained my favor, and I have singled you out by name. He said, oh, let me behold your presence.
Pause there
And
for a
he
moment,
answered,
Tamar. Oh, sorry, just one quick sec. Two important things. When it says gain my favor, the Hebrew there is very telling. It says, ki matzata, you have found, chen, grace, favor, however you want to do it, be, and I, in my eye. So already we're using that language of God's eye. But then So that's the first challenge there. But then what Moshe actually asks for, and this is interesting, he says, Hareini, show me, please, Hareini na, please show me et kevodecha. Now, the word kavod is easily translated as honor. It also has a sense of weightiness. Literally, it can be the word for weight, something heavy. But he doesn't say, show me your hand or your face or anything like that. It says, show me your honor. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. What does it mean? Your honor, your glory, whatever. But again, we already see that God's talking about my eye. Now, to say you have found favor on my eye, that could be kind of a metaphor, a phrase. Like maybe God doesn't mean literally my eye. It's just, with me. That's just the way people talk. I like you. I'm pleased with you, Moshe. I'm not going to abandon you. But the way God responds next really doesn't sit well with our 21st century 5783 understanding of God. So please continue, Tamar, to Hashem's answer at verse 19.
And he answered, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord, and the grace that I grant, and the compassion that I show. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for men may not see me and live. And the Lord said, see, there is a place near me. Station yourself on the rock, and as my presence passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen.
We don't need to go to the Hebrew for this because it'll just be a translation, direct from the English. This couldn't be any clearer. God talks about God's hand. God talks about him having something which can't. Now, he says human beings are not able to see it and live. But there's an assumption there, or not an assumption, explicitly there, that a human could see it and then they would just die. But that means there is something to see. There are hands. God says, I'm going to use my hand to shield you. I have a back that I will let you see. So the only part of God that a human being, whether or not he's a great human like Moshe or even the average human, but there are parts of God which can be seen, God's acharai, God's back. So the language here doesn't mince words. And again, there are dozens of examples explicitly throughout the Torah that talks about God's physical presence, God's arm, etc., like that. Now, just because God could have some sort of physical thing, it doesn't mean that God's power is not beyond anything. Doesn't mean that God didn't create the universe, but the language of the Torah is pretty clear that God does have some sort of physical, seeable form. But as we might know today, or maybe you don't know, is the assumption is that God doesn't have a body. So what do we do with this text? So before we get into the understandings of that, the first question we're actually going to look at is, why does Moshe even want to see God? Why is he insisting on this? Now, I started to give you a little bit of the context. This is after the sin of the golden calf. God is clearly furious. The people are stiff-necked, stubborn people. God is changing some things. I'm not going to walk amongst them the way that going amongst them, like presuming that God has legs or something like that. I'm not going to go amongst them by moving the tent. So Moshe does have some reason to be concerned. But Moshe's concern here doesn't say, I want to know that you're still with the people. God said, I'm still going to lead the people into the land. God keeps saying here, favor me, do this for me if you still like me. I'm not going to say it's selfish, but it's all about Moshe. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And again, we're not going to be exhaustive because again, there's so many sources, but I want to give you some of the key sources that kind of capture a lot of the ideas that many other rabbis share. So this is 15th century Italy, Ovadia Sforno, and him and the Rashbam talk about why is Moshe so insistent on seeing anything of God or being aware of God's presence in any way. So Gloria, go ahead, source number one from the Sforno. You can just start in the English, by possessing.
By possessing knowledge and an appreciation of your mode of operation, I myself attain favor in your eyes. A similar thought has been expressed in Jeremiah 9:23. Quote, let the one who wants to boast about the degree of knowledge about me that he has acquired. For I, the Lord, am fond of those who make knowing me better their principal objective.
So the way I would translate this is the class pet. Moshe wants to be the class pet. And based on this line in Yirmiyahu, God is basically, our understanding of it is God is saying is, I like kids who want to be the class pet, who want to be close to the teacher. But in other words, Moshe is not doing it because he's selfish and something like that. He says, the most important thing in the world is, God, show me that you're happy with me. I want you to know that I love you and I want to know more about you, and let me know that I'm doing the right thing. And God's response is, I love people who want to, I don't want to say suck up because that diminishes what he's doing here, but Moshe says, like, I want you to know that I want to know that you're happy with me because that's the most important thing in the world. And God says, yeah, is you wanting to praise me is the most important thing in the world. So this turns Moshe's motivation not into a selfish one, but to say, God, I need your praise to know that to show me that I'm doing the right thing. And Rashbam builds on that a little bit. So Alina, if you would go ahead and read source number 2. And again, Rashbam, 12th century Troyes, which is modern day France. He is the grandson of Rashi, to put him in historical and intellectual context. So again, you can start in the English at first glance.
Okay. At first glance, we must surely wonder how Moses could have had the audacity to demand to see God, and to ask for such as a means to derive personal satisfaction from it. It is totally incompatible with the attitude Moses displayed at the burning bush, when the very thought of seeing something divine filled him with fear and he was afraid to look. Exodus 3:6. There can be no question but what motivated Moses to formulate the above request was only that God would fulfill his two wishes, one, to distinguish him individually, and two, to personally travel with the people. To this effect, he added,
please show me your honor, your glory. That's the Hebrew.
Referring to previous occasions when a covenant had been concluded between God and Abraham, and as a sign of this, Abraham had witnessed the entire procedure of the covenant between the pieces in Genesis 15:18. Moses, as Abraham before him, asked for some sign that the covenant would endure. We read about this occurring in 34:6 and 10, where Moses has a special personal revelation, which includes God revealing to him 13 of his attributes, each of which is of relevance when inducing forgiveness and repentance. In verse 10, in that chapter, God promises to make this special relationship manifest by hitherto unheard of miracles. The distinction God provided for Moses was such that the people did not dare approach him, as the light radiating from his forehead blinded them.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a little bit there that's we could unpack later, but basically Rashbam recognizes that this seems kind of like chutzpahdik, we would say in Hebrew. First of all, Moshe, the first time he knew of God's presence at the burning bush, he said, I can't, I'm uncomfortable being here. This is too much for me. And now he's saying, show me your face, God. So it's trying to put this in context of, no, he's not being audacious. Although in some ways he says, like, he does want God to say, you're special. For God to say, Moshe, you're special, and you are going to allow me to travel with the people. And just like you made these promises, you proved these covenants with Abraham, I want to make sure that you're going to stick with me. So unlike Ovadia Sforno, where it's more about like affirming that he's doing the right thing, here it is a little bit about personal, like, you know, I want some guarantees that I'm still special. But again, we can kind of understand it, and it's within a tradition of people before him that say, God, I want to be in a relationship with you. And Yaakov did that too. Jacob said, God, when he was sleeping in the dream of the ladder and stuff like that, he said, God, I will be with you, but I need you to promise that you protect me. So at the end of the day, the answer, why does Moshe want to see God? Because he's human. And sometimes we need reassurances from the ones that we love to know that they're still with us and they still love us. Susan, you have your hand up, please.
Oh, yeah, thank you. A couple of things. One is in response to this. This is after he's been given the charge of leading the people out of Egypt, isn't it? I mean, he knows he's got this job and this responsibility and wants to make sure he's got it right. The first time he sees the burning bush, he's, oh, whoa, what that is, you know, he's kind of freaked out by that because he doesn't know what's happening. But he hadn't been given the charge to lead the people at that time, had he? Or am I
No, his only charge there was to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go, and then let him go into the desert and daven. So he didn't know about this big journey. So you're saying here there's a new additional responsibility, and he's saying, God, like, I need to know that you're with me in this big journey. Is that what you're saying?
Did he know about going to Egypt, going to Pharaoh before he saw the bush or afterwards?
It was after he saw the bush.
Yeah, okay. Well,
that's where he got the mission. At the bush is where he got the
mission.
mission.
Okay, so now he understands what's going on and he's curious. But I had a question going back to the Hebrew and the previous reading from Shemot 33.
You mean all the way at the top?
Well, right there. So let's see, there's something about, not that far back, but it's, it's B. No, that's not this for, Oh no,
if you remember, we
can
always go back to it later.
Yeah, it is before B. It's the okay, right. Okay, before that, there's what he's talking about, my grace and my compassion.
Mercy.
Is that the Hanoti?
Yeah, v'chanoti, and my grace at the sherachon, which I will grace you with, v'richamti, and I will be merciful to you at the sherachon.
Okay, and this Yud Kaf Vav Kaf, is that?
That's just this version of it that I copied. It changed it from Yud Hey Vav and Hey.
Okay, all right.
It's just the name of God.
That's what I wanted. Okay, great. So Hanot. Okay, thank you.
Of course, and Susan, stay unmuted because I'll have you read the next thing. So now that we've seen perhaps his personal motivation, and Susan, you actually added a lot to that, is the situation has changed here. He's being asked to be a new kind of leader, and he's concerned. He's very human. But now, remembering that he's human, why is it that humans can't, if there is a face of God to see, let's say we take the text at face value, there's a face to see, why can't he see his face? Why is it a death sentence for humans? And by the way, there's a lot of other implications of God saying, people can't see me, yet it also says he speaks to Moshe face to face. So what's the deal here with human beings not being able to see God's full face and whatever that represents? So here we're in the 13th century in France, in a work known as the Chizkuni, which is from his name. And go ahead, Susan, for as long as a human being.
Okay, for as long as a human being is alive, they cannot experience my essence visually. According to Rabbi Shimon the Yemenite, the definition of a human being is that they are alive. But even celestial creatures named
Chayot
are named thus to remind us that though they live forever, they too are not able to have a visual experience of God's essence. If you were to counter that,
meaning if you brought the argument,
if you were to counter that, Isaiah 6:2 claimed to have experienced such a visual revelation when he said, I have seen God seated on a throne. This did not describe what is known as a clear vision, but as something at best like a reflection from a mirror. He had been screened by a partition at the time.
So the context of Isaiah, when he's, before exile, when he sees this vision, he sees God on a throne, it's pretty clear that he's seeing it in a dream. By the way, Yosef, Yaakov, when he experiences God, it's in a dream. So most of these people are only seeing it in a dream. So we don't have any good examples elsewhere in the Tanakh of people actually seeing God. So this is the one instance of somebody who's as close to God as can be, and God saying, you, who speaks to me face to face, still can't see my face. So it doesn't quite give us an explicit answer, but what they're saying us is that anybody who is alive is simply unable to see it. So this is more not an explanation, it's more defining the limitations. Anything that is alive, even beings that are angels that are defined as these chayot, these beings, they still can't see God's face either. But we're still left with the question of why? Why can't a living being see it? So, Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And now we jump forward in history. Now we're in the 18th century in Morocco. And Rabbi Chaim Ibn Abtar, the Orach Chaim, is going to try and understand this a little bit better. So go ahead, please. He said.
Okay, Vayomer lo tuchal lirot. He said, you are not able to see, etc. God meant that it was not he who withheld visual insights from Moses. It was simply that being a mortal human being A composite of flesh and spirit made such a thing impossible. This is why God added the word v'chai, to remain alive, to explain to Moses that because God wanted Moses to remain alive, he could not grant his wish at this time. This would correspond to the thoughts expressed by the psalmist when he said, Psalms 84:11, better a day in your courtyard than 1,000 days in your palace. Alternatively, we may understand this verse to mean that even a man were chai, i.e., a perfectly righteous individual, immortal, God cannot be seen by man. We would have to understand the word chai in the sense it is used in Samuel 2:23-20, where Benayahu, son of Yehoiada, is described as Ben Ish Chai, a perfectly righteous individual. The letter Vav at the beginning of the word v'chai in our verse indicates that it adds something to what had already been stated, i.e., the inability to see. Still, another way of understanding the words Kilo Yir'eni Adam v'chai is that even after death, it is impossible for man to see God. God asks, how can you expect to see God while still alive? Whatever light the righteous will be able to see in the hereafter does not come close to what you, Moses, are asking of me at this time.
Excellent, thank you. Now, this source and the Chizkuni, they have something in common, which is that even though they say a human being can't see God and live, and what the Orach Chaim that we just read adds to it, is that it's not that God is not allowing man to see God, it's that man is physically and psychologically incapable of doing it. Maybe even when man is a spirit can still see God, but the implication here is that there is something to be seen. It's beyond our kin. So a good example would be, if you look up in the sky, you can see a star, you can see the moon. But if I say, I want you to see the entire galaxy or the universe or stare into the sun, it would burn out a person's eyes. So there are things which there is something there. There is a presence which can be seen, but we are physically unable to do so. In some ways, the sun is a good example of that. Our eyes are not capable of staring at the sun. They will be destroyed. Hypothetically, it could be looked at, but it would, blind us. So too with God, there is something which can be seen. There is a face, there is a back, but it is somehow beyond. It's not a face like we're used to. But again, up till this point, the rabbis read between the lines or explicitly, there is something that can be seen. So when we say that God, when Moshe saw Hashem's back, he saw something. There was a back there to be seen. It may not be like the back all of you have, but we'll come back to that. That's the second horrible pun I've done this class. But there is still something that can be called an acharai, can be called a back. So again, at this point, even by the 18th century, when you're reading the text, it's pretty hard not to take the text as it is written. So before we go on to the next section about some of the understandings of what Moshe actually saw, any questions up until now? And for all of those who just joined or those who have not been in class before, welcome. It's wonderful to see you, and there'll be time at the end for questions if you're pondering right now. Any questions up until now? Excellent. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to go back to you, and this next section here is, what did Moshe actually see? And this is where we start getting into the tradition where the rabbis are getting a little bit uncomfortable with saying that he saw God's back. But what you do see here is the implication or the understanding that Moshe did actually see something. So again, if we're going to jump to our current understanding that God has no physical presence, God is the manifestation of the entire universe, it's impossible to see God any more than it is possible to hold the universe in your hand. That's not what the rabbis are saying here. There was something that was seen. And in fact, in this source in the Talmud, it actually gets a little weird about what Moshe saw. So go ahead, please, Tamar, source number 1 in Brachot.
What did Moses see? It is said, and I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face you will not see. Exodus 33:23. Rav Hana Bar Bizna said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Hasidah, the expression, and you will see my back, should be understood as follows. This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, who, as mentioned above, wears phylacteries,
or tefillin,
showed him the knot of the phylacteries of his head, which is worn on the back of the head.
Excellent. So before I go on that, Ron, who's joining us tonight, just pointed out that he's an LPS alum. So Ron, it's wonderful to have you back. And hopefully we'll have a chance for questions and people can schmooze at the end. But we cannot know if this is meant to be taken literally or if it's a midrash to show that God symbolically wears tefillin. And in fact, in Shabbat morning services, there's this beautiful prayer, Anim Zemirot, and it talks about God's tefillin in it, God's being adorned by it. And again, is it meant to be taken literally? And in fact, some rabbis say that if a group is davening, praying, and they don't have a minyan, they shouldn't say it. Why? Because if you're just saying it alone, it's such a potentially problematic prayer because it's talking about God having a physical body and God wearing tefillin that it'll just confuse people. But again, the implication here is that not only does God have some sort of body, but God can wear clothing and God can wear tefillin. Again, is it meant to be taken literally? It's not entirely clear. However, the fact that it talks about it means that the idea of God having some sort of physical presence is not such a heretical out there idea. Yeah, Tamar, please.
It's Anim Zmirot is very anthropomorphic.
Yes, it gives God physical attributes. So that's again, one of the
only language that we have. That's the only language that we have to describe anything of that sort, I guess.
So we're going to come back to exactly what you said there, which is if God, let's say God just has a body. Okay, well, that's heretical today, but maybe that's what they believed back then. Who knows? Only God knows. But let's say God doesn't have a body, then why does it use all these anthropomorphic, giving God physical attributes? So we'll come back to that. But clearly, many, many rabbis look at the text and understand it as some sort of physical thing. Again, do we know for certain that they meant for us to take it literal or not? No, we don't. But again, the fact that they're so comfortable talking about God in anthropomorphic terms means that it's not a crazy idea for them to be open to the idea that God could sit on a throne, that God has some sort of physical being that could walk somewhere. Now, God's physical being might be far more vast and infinite and massive than we could ever possibly imagine, but a lot of these texts seem to hint towards that, and the rabbis are more comfortable with it. So this next source here, the Torah Aruch, this is Yaakov ben Asher. Yaakov ben Asher, his father was Rabbeinu Asher, who was an incredible, Yaakov ben Asher, he grew up in Ashkenaz and then he went to Spain, and he wrote a very important halachic work, the Arba Torim, and he wrote a very important commentary on the Torah. So, Alina, if you could please read this source from Yaakov ben Asher. I said, please.
Okay. I said, please, reveal to me your glory. Moses requested that God show him his true face in a vision, something our sages are in the habit of referring to as
Aspaklaria hamira, or me'ira.
Okay, a clear, unambiguous visual image. God answered him that he would do what he would do was to parade before him a number of phenomena, each of which represented some of the ways in which he demonstrated his earnest desire to be a benefit to his creatures. As a result of viewing these phenomena one after another, he, more than any other human being, would develop an appreciation of what God's essence was all about. However, it was impossible to him to do more without terminating Moses' life, as it was not given to mortals to get a still deeper insight into what an eternal God, the creator of the universe, was truly like.
Excellent. So when we go back to the Talmud, which is, let's say, 5th, 6th century and goes all the way back to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, they seem much more comfortable with the idea of God having some sort of physical attributes that can be discussed. And I'll mention another famous work when we get to some of the later texts. But again, the Talmud seems, again, very comfortable with God being able to wear tefillin. But here, by the 14th century, you have a pretty mainstream, very important rabbi saying that, no, what Moshe saw is not actually a physical thing. He didn't see God's back. God gave him visions, just like Yaakov, of these, of galaxies or universes or whatever he saw. But but only an aspect of God's creation. Again, if you could just close your eyes and see the entirety of the universe, your head might explode. But if you look in a telescope, you might be able to see a spiral galaxy, and that really does take your breath away. So perhaps what Moshe saw was some small percentage of God's great universe. Now that is beautiful. That is a stunning image, a lovely interpretation. But again, it's not really what the text said. It said he saw God's back. But you can see here the shift and that discomfort with what the Torah actually said. It needs to interpret it in a non-literal way. So the question is, why? So what we're going to do here, and I think it's the last section, is the idea that God doesn't have a physical form. Where did that idea come from? And when did that shift really happen? Because there's an early work, I don't remember the exact century, called Sefer HaKomot, or Sefer HaKoma, meaning the book of height or measurements. And it's a kind of a mystical book. And what it does is it basically says God is this tall. God's hand is this long. Now, the measurements it gives, at least for the time, are insanely huge. You know, the equivalent of millions of feet or millions of miles for God's fingernail or something like that, which is, you know, perhaps implying that God is just so far beyond our understanding. But a book like that, the fact that it could be written and accepted fairly mainstream, even if it was kind of esoteric, it is generally accepted, implies that, again, their understanding is that God was a being that could exist. Maybe God could take different forms. When God came down in the world, God would come down as smoke or dust, but God was a physical being that is manifest in the universe. God created the universe, but God is a being within the universe that happened to create it, which again, that's a little over our heads. But at some point, the idea that God could have a physical being was just thrown out the window. And the person who said absolutely not was Maimonides. He may not be the first thinker to ever propose that idea, but really the shift to God having no physical attributes that can be defined whatsoever was really Maimonides. He codified it, and basically you could say, you know, BM and AM, before Maimonides and after Maimonides. Before Maimonides, you could have a book like Sefer HaKoma, where you could talk about God's measurements. After Maimonides, don't you dare ever talking about God having a presence. And that idea, particularly in the Kabbalah, about God being the universe, just took off. But again, before Maimonides, you saw there were a lot of rabbis were comfortable with the idea of maybe there is something that Moshe saw, and it was an aspect or physical part of God. But Maimonides comes along, and what Maimonides says actually makes a lot of sense. He brings up some real logical challenges. So Jane, if you would please take, and I'll continue on to the next page, and this is in his Yesodei HaTorah. So this is a halachic work, the Mishnah Torah, but in his halachic work, he has sections where he also talks about theology and philosophy, but by putting in it a legalistic work, he's also implying that this is binding. You gotta believe this. So please, Jane, behold.
Behold, it is clearly indicated in the Torah and in the prophets that the Holy One, blessed is he, is incorporeal, for it is said that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth beneath. Deuteronomy 4:39. A corporeal being is incapable of being in two places simultaneously. And it is also said, for ye saw no manner of form. Also Deuteronomy 15. And it is moreover said, to whom you will liken me, that I should be equal. Isaiah 40:25. Had he been is that the way you pronounce it? Corporeal, he would be like other bodies. What was it then that Moses, our master, sought to attain when he said, show me, I pray thee, thy glory? Exodus. He desired to know the truth of the existence of the Holy One, blessed is he, with a thorough knowledge within his heart, even as he would know a certain person whose countenance he saw and whose likeness was imprinted upon his heart, so that he could find him in his mind's vision separated from other persons. Even so, did Moses, our master, seek to establish the existence of the Holy One, blessed is he, separated within his heart from other beings, until he would know the truth of his existence as it is. And he, blessed is he, answered him, that it is not within the intellectual power of the living man, who is a composite of body and soul, to reach the pure truth of this matter. But he, blessed is he, imparted to him that which no man before him did, nor no man after him shall know, for he fathomed the subject of the true existence of the Holy One, blessed is he, even so that he became separated in his mind's vision from other beings. As for instance, he could separate in his mind a certain person whose back and body and clothes he saw from bodies of other persons. And concerning this matter, the passage points saying, "And thou shalt see my back, but my face shall not be seen."
Excellent, thank you. Now, Maimonides' logical, and there's actually more text that goes into this, more examples, but his logical explanation for why God can't be a physical being is it says God is in the heaven and the earth. Well, if we look at that Sefer Koma, that book of measurements, how can God be in two places? Because God is massive. God is a vast being that could be in two places just because God is so big. Or maybe God can move really fast, or God can teleport or transport. So the reality is that it is possible to push back on Maimonides. Now, again, Maimonides is generally been more than generally. Maimonides' understanding of God lacking a physical human form is accepted. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more here that an academic class could bring in about influence from other religions and rejecting them, et cetera, like that. But one of the problems we have here is, again, what the Torah says, and not just that, how many rabbis in the Talmud have understood or seem to have understood this text. So let's say Maimonides is right, great, but what he's also implying is that all of these great rabbis in the Talmud are a bunch of heretics for saying that God is physical form. And somebody who pushes back on this is a rabbi known as the Ra'avad, who wrote right after Rambam's time. He wrote these comments challenging, pushing back on Rambam. So Jane, you can take this as well because it's so short. So go ahead, please. Source number 2.
He who says there is one Lord, but that he is corporeal and has a form, why does he call such one an atheist? Many greater and better than he followed this opinion according to what they saw in phrases, and more particularly in the text of the Aggadot, legends of the Talmud, which misdirect opinions.
Excellent. So he's saying here is rabbis far greater than the rabbis of the Talmud. Like, who's greater than them? Whether or not we misunderstand their midrash or not, great rabbis have clearly understood God to have a body. Now, there's an interesting thing here. The Ra'avad agrees with Rambam and says he doesn't have a body. But again, if you read the Torah, it's not crazy to think that God has a body. So it's interesting there. Ravad says, don't call them atheists because it seems pretty obvious, but God obviously doesn't have a body. Well, I'm not sure how Ravad gets to that conclusion then. If men far greater and wiser in the Talmud seem to think that God has a body, why do we assume that they're wrong? So again, there's so much more you can unpack there. But as we've seen within our tradition, there are plenty of sources that are comfortable with saying that God has some sort of physical form. Now, again, it might be vast and nearly infinite, but Rambam's take that there's no physical form whatsoever is not so obvious. And in fact, the last little source that we have here, going back to the Talmud, brings up another interesting question, which is in the beginning. It says that God creates us in God's image. Well, I'm looking at all of you wonderful people with your lovely faces, with your eyes, your noses, and your mouths. Well, if we're in the image of God, what does that mean? And that's a very difficult text to understand if God has no image for us to be made in. So in source number 3, it says, the Gemara raises a difficulty, and some of this is explanation. It's not a direct translation of the Aramaic or the Hebrew. However, if that is so, let the fashioning of an image of a human face, a partsuf is the form of the face, alone be permitted. Why then is it taught in a Baraita, a source contemporaneous with the Mishnah? All faces are permitted for ornamental purposes except for the face of a person. So it's talking about idolatrous things, about what's permitted, but a human face you can't make. Why? Rav Huna, son of Rav Idi, said, from a lecture of Abai, I heard that there's a different reason why one may not form an image of a human face. As the verse states, you shall not make with me. Don't make et. This can be read as, you shall not make me ot, since man is created in the image of God. It is prohibited to form an image of a human being. So if I make a statue of a human face, why is that idolatrous? Because God has a face. God has, again, this implies that there is a face of God, and perhaps it does look like us.